Well, hello, brothers and sisters. Oh my goodness, it's just so wonderful to be with you today. This is, of course, Readings with Regina, and I am Dr. Regina Jennings, and I'm going to get right in to my program today because I have three books that I absolutely want to share with you today. So the first one is going to be The Half Has Never Been Told: Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. And I just want to remind you that I'm trying to get rid of this book. Hold it from the screen. Let's see. Hi. Here we go. I want to remind you that it's imperative that you talk about with other people what it is that I read to you today and every episode. Now, this episode is called The Lassoed Brother and the Black Nationalist Freedom Fighter During Enslavement. So I'm going to first read from, like I said, The Half Has Never Been Told, and you'll see what I mean about the lassoed brother. Okay, so here we go. On a bright spring Maryland morning in 1805, Charles Ball rode comfortably on the board seat of a wagon, the lead rope of his owner's yoke of oxen in his hands. He was driving the team to a little town on the bank of the Patuxent River. Ball's latest owner, he'd had five in his 25 years, was a hard man. Mr. Ballard would make a slave work in the woods on the snowiest of days with no boots. But Ball had hopes. All through the neighborhood, he was known as a strong, intelligent worker with a steady temper, unlike his irascible African grandfather or his runaway father. Charles Ball had been hired out to the Washington Navy Yard and had come back instead of running away, like so many others had done when they had worked abroad. Remember, I told you about the abroad slaves in a previous episode? That is, slaves who were hired out from one plantation or one owner to go work for somebody else. And of course, the owner of the enslaved person would get the money, not the enslaved laborer. So he was an abroad enslaved man, Charles Ball was. Ball could figure out faster, smarter ways to do any job. He had incentives, a wife and children, owned by another man. His wife and children were owned by another enslaver, which means then, like Fred Douglass's mother, Charles Ball had to travel with his owner's permission to see his wife and children. Ball Ball's extra hours supplied his family with food and clothing. Although he would later laugh at his younger self, the 25-year-old Charles Ball hoped for his own and his family's freedom. And he was not alone. In Maryland's decaying tobacco economy, enslavers were allowing many African Americans to buy their freedom. The free constituted 5% of the state's 111,000 people of African descent in 1790. This is 20 or more years after the Revolutionary War, 1776, and 22% of 145,000 by 1810. Maryland was becoming a middle ground between a slave society and a free one. When Ball reached a little town, he followed his master's instructions, tying the team of oxen up by the store that Ballard owned there. His owner eventually appeared on horseback, went inside, and sat down to breakfast with the shopkeeper. Soon Ballard emerged and told Ball to come in and finish the leftovers. That is, his owner had a plate of food and the owner ate the food, but he left some leftovers for his enslaved man, Charles Ball. As Ball sat down, he saw through the wavy glass of the kitchen window his owner talking emphatically with another white man. Uneasily swallowing a last mouthful, Ball stood up and walked slowly out. He began hitching up the oxen, fumbling with the leather and rope. Suddenly, he felt the presence of several people looming around him. He turned, as out of nowhere a dozen white men had surrounded him. Before his eyes had time to flicker from one hard face to the next, his head jerked back as someone seized him by the collar from behind. "You my property now," a voice shouted in Ball's ear. And as Ball whipped his head around, he saw the man with whom Ballard had been whispering. "You must go with me to Georgia," the stranger snarled. Ball stood in shock. White men grabbed and bent his arms. Quickly, someone knotted his hands together behind his back. "Mister, you are my property now," abruptly shoved Ball forward, and he stumbled. The crowd giggled. The enslaved man was suddenly helpless, barely able to stay on his feet. Playing desperately for time, Ball asked to see his wife and children. "You can get another wife in Georgia," countered his captor. Ball felt incapable of weeping, and so he later said, "In my despair, I laughed loudly." Pro-slavery writers later sneered at reformers who depicted slave transactions as sentimental tragedies, as if to say, "Hey, they laugh when they are sold, so how bad can it be?" In their daily lives, enslavers understood that a laugh could be the only way to keep alive the ability to express something, anything. But behind the laugh, the word Georgia was racing through Ball's mind. Every African American in Maryland knew that word. By 1805, almost every slave had a personal Georgia story. Ball's was the only thing he remembered about his mother. In 1784, Lord have mercy, just a few years after the Revolutionary War, when Charles was 4, his mother's owner went broke as tobacco prices collapsed. Doing the only thing he could do to escape his debts, the man died. And when the day came for the sale of the dead man's property, Charles, his mother, and his older brothers and sisters stood in the yard in front of the old Calvert County, Maryland house. Ball's father, who was owned by another man, was not allowed to leave work to see them before they were sold off. This was for safety's sake. A man who had to see his own son stand naked before buyers might do anything. But among those who showed up were several men who had traveled a long way to Maryland. They came from South Carolina and Georgia. These men wanted to buy workers to work in the rice swamps and indigo fields and to fell the interior forests as the Catawba Indians retreated. Dig this. The Catawba Indians, understand that during this time period, okay, enslavers, Europeans, white Americans were committing genocide on the indigenous people here, the Native Americans, as they were enslaving African people. Although by 1784, they hadn't yet figured out what they would plant on that raw, new, upcountry soil. They could pay a higher price than any Maryland buyer, what local sellers called a foreign price. Several Carolina men divided up Ball and his brothers and sisters. A Georgia man brought his mother. Charles was too young to be worth carrying 500 miles. A Maryland man bought the little boy and wrapped him in his own child's spare gown, putting Charles up in front of him. The buyer turned his horse's head toward home. Before he could leave, Charles's mother came running up, weeping. She took Charles down into her arms, hugged him, and pleaded through tears for the man to buy them all. She only got a moment to make her case. Down came the Georgia man, running in his heavy boots, wading into her with his whip, beating her shoulders until she handed Charles over. The Georgia buyer dragged her, screaming, toward the yard. The crying boy clung to the Maryland man, his new owner. So you see, this was the lassoed man. Now, when you understand that this is foundational Black American history, African American history, American history, these kinds of incidents, although painful, are important to note because they are a true representation of what many of our ancestors, if not most, went through as we were brought to these American shores to work for free. So the kind of ill at ease that you all might feel of African ancestry, and even those who are not obviously African, you are feeling the tensions of what these people went through centuries ago. It hasn't gone away, even though many of us might push it down. But the only way to heal a problem is to, first of all, recognize the problem and also recognize that the problem has not been resolved. All right. I want to show you. This is the Fred. Now, we have to read Fred Douglass. I mean, we're going to read Brother Fred, a little bit of him. But you know what? I want to show you something. I noticed that my version of Fred Douglass, right, is the book itself. It's different from, say, this newer version. This newer version says, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. Cool. That's young Fred. All right, I can dig it. But my old version says, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, written by himself. Now, isn't that interesting? That the American slave part, or even written by himself, is not really there. It's funny how book covers can change over time, but the words within are pretty much still the same. But that written by himself, that's not there. And I just wonder, I absolutely do wonder about that being erased. Because as I said in a previous episode, the written by himself, right, was like in the 19th century, this man wrote this book by a slave writing a book by himself. Whoa, that was big news. And Fred Douglass could write so very, very well. So let me read a little bit from Fred before we go to the Black nationalist freedom fighter during the enslavement period. Now, this is Fred Douglass. The wife of Mr. Gills Hick, living but a short distance from where I used to live, murdered my wife's cousin, a young girl between 15 and 16 years of age, mangling her person in the most horrible manner, breaking her nose and breastbone with a stick, so that the poor girl expired in a few hours afterward. She was immediately buried, but not been in her untimely grave but a few hours before she was taken up and examined by the coroner, who decided that she had come to her death by severe beating. The offense for which this girl was thus murdered was this: she had been set that night to mind Mrs. Hicks's baby, and during the night she fell asleep, and the baby cried. She, having lost her rest for several nights previous, did not hear the crying. They were both in the room with Mrs. Hicks. Mrs. Hicks, finding the girl slow to move, jumped from her bed, seized an oak stick of wood by the fireplace, and with it broke the girl's nose and breastbone, and thus ended her life. I will not say that this most horrid murder produced no sensation in the community. It did produce sensation, but not enough to bring the murderers to punishment. There was a warrant issued for her arrest, but it was never served. Thus she escaped not only punishment, but even the pain of being arraigned before a court for her horrendous crime. Whilst I am detailing bloody deeds which took place during my stay on Colonel Lloyd's plantation, I will briefly narrate another, which occurred about the same time as the murder of Denby by Mr. Gore. Colonel Lloyd's slaves were in the habit of spending a part of their nights and Sundays in fishing for oysters, and in this way made up the deficiency of their scanty allowance. An old man belonging to Colonel Lloyd, while thus engaged, happened to get beyond the limits of Colonel Lloyd's and on the premises of a Mr. Beale Bondley. At this trespass, Mr. Bondley took offense, and with his musket came down to the shore and blew its deadly contents into the poor old man. Mr. Bondley came over to see Colonel Lloyd the next day, whether to pay him for his property or to justify himself in what he had done. I know not. At any rate, this whole fiendish transaction was soon hushed up. There was very little said about it at all, and nothing done. It was common saying, even among little white boys, that it was worth a half cent to kill a nigger and a half cent to bury one. Okay. Well, I know I haven't delighted you with my readings, but once again, this is a history that should not be forgotten, and it's always overlooked. Always overlooked in the mainstream media, in the political arena. It's just skipped over. America the Beautiful. America just became beautiful all by itself, by those rugged individuals. So, I'm taking it upon myself in this series to share with you some of the true history of this country. Now, this book, let me see if I can find it. Blake, or the Huts of America. It is indeed about the freedom fighter, the Black nationalist freedom fighter that I mentioned to you, Martin Delany. And let me tell you about Martin Delany. He's quite a fellow. Now, he was born in 1812. And what was so remarkable about Martin Delany is that his mother was free. So remember, I told you in previous episodes that the status of slavery went according to the mother's position. So Martin Delany was the child of a free mother, but check this out. His father was an enslaved man. Can you imagine this? So his free mother married to an enslaved father. Can you imagine how they could work out ways to see each other? Anyway, they produced Martin Delany, who's one of the greatest men in American history. This is what he did when he wanted to be a doctor. Now, of course, rampant racism and segregation was throughout the land in the 19th century. So he couldn't just go to any medical school. So Brother Love would sit outside of medical school classes and take notes. This is what he did because he wanted to become a doctor. He also was exceedingly interested in eradicating slavery. In fact, him and Frederick Douglass, they were friends. When Douglass had finally freed himself, and I'll be getting to that, later in later episodes, Frederick Douglass started a newspaper called the North Star. Well, Martin Delany worked with him on the North Star. You dig? And Delany would be the one going out into the communities selling subscriptions. Delany also went to Africa. Now, check this out. Talked to African chieftains because his plan was if he could get Black enslaved Americans back to Africa, they could create crops. They could create food supplies that they could then sell around the world, just like what America does. Now, he also went to South America, Central America, with this same idea. In other words, Brother Love, Martin Delany, was looking at the big picture for Black people. He wanted to build a nation within a nation or a nation outside of this nation that was so full of racism and slavery. This was Martin Delany. Martin Delany was such a figure of importance that during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln made him a general. Made this man a general. And even after the Civil War, Martin Delany was considered to be a vice presidential candidate, but I believe Wendell Phillips. Now, you know that didn't happen, but nevertheless, this brother, because of his brilliance, because of his activism, was even considered for that high office. Now, Martin Delany wrote a novel because he wanted to challenge Harriet Beecher Stowe's rendition of Uncle Tom in Uncle Tom's Cabin. So he wanted to write about the kind of brothers that he actually saw in the Black community when he was selling the North Star for Fred Douglass. So he wrote this novel. And I have to say up front, he's not a smooth writer like our Fred Douglass. I mean, Fred Douglass could just, he was just a great writer. Blake is not exactly in this novel a smooth writer like Fred Douglass was. But this novel is so important. I'm going to tell you this story just before I get into the novel. This novel was so important that when I was teaching in universities, right? Male students, once I assigned this book, male students that more than once would come into my office and say, Dr. Jennings, look, I don't want to read anything else. Can I just read the whole thing of Blake? You can quiz me on it. You can test me on it. I just want to know more about Blake or the Huts of America. So I noticed, because I had no idea, I noticed what this book was doing for my young Black male students. Okay? Whether I say it was written greatly or not, that's not even the issue. This is an important novel, and it was written in a serial form, and it would appear in the Afro-American magazine. They had Black magazines back during slavery. So it's written in a rather episodic manner. And because of that, I'm not even going to start from the beginning. I'm going to start in chapter 3. This is the scenario. Blake, his name is also Henry, is away from the plantation. His wife is on the plantation. And his owner, Colonel Franks, wants to sell his wife. But the wife of Colonel Franks does not want her maidservant, her name is Maggie. She doesn't want Maggie sold, but her husband wants her sold, and they want to sell her to their cousin. Okay. Because the cousin wants to take Maggie to Cuba. Because in Cuba, the Southern expansionists, they had slavery in Cuba and it was welcomed. Okay. So this is chapter 3, and this is called The Fate of Maggie. After dinner, Colonel Franks again pressed the inquiry concerning the disposition of his lady, that's his wife. At this time, the maid, that's Maggie, was in the culinary department taking her dinner. The children having been served, she preferred the company of her old mother, whom she loved. The children hanging around and upon her lap. There was no servant save the boy Tony present in the parlor. I can't. I won't let her go. She's a dear good girl, replied Mrs. Franks. The children are attached to her, and so am I. Let Minnie or any other of them go, but do not, for heaven's sake, tear Maggie from me. Maria, my dear, you certainly lost your balance of mind. Do try to compose yourself, admonished the colonel. There's certainly no disposition to do contrary to your desires. Try and be a little reasonable. I'm sure, cousin, I see no cause for your importunity. No one that I know of designs to hurt the Negro girl. I'm sure it's not me, impatiently remarked Mrs. Ballard. During this, the boy had several times gone into the hall, looking toward the kitchen, then meaningly into the parlor as if something unusual was going on. Mammy Judy became suspicious, went into the hall, and stood close beside the parlor door, listening at the conversation. Cousin, if you will listen for a moment, I wish to say a word to you, said Mrs. Ballard. The judge, as you know, has a country seat in Cuba, near the city of Havana, where we design making every year our winter retreat. As we cannot take with us either free Negroes or white servants on account of the existing restrictions, I must have a slave. And of course, I prefer a well trained one, as I know all yours to be. The price will be no object. See, these are rich whites. As I know it will be none to you. It shall be none to me. I will not consent to part with her, cousin Arabella, and it is useless to press the matter any further, emphatically replied Mrs. Franks. I am sure, cousin Maria, it was well understood between the colonel and the judge that I was to have one of your best trained maidservants, continued Mrs. Ballard. The colonel and the judge. If any understanding exists, it is without my knowledge and consent, and it is true, my dear, interposed the colonel. But then she replied, Heaven grant that I may go too. Oh, Maria Franks, I'm really astonished at you to take on so about a Negro girl. You really appear to have lost your reason. I would not behave so for all the Negroes in Mississippi, my dear, said Franks. I have been watching the conduct of that girl for some time past. She is becoming both disobedient and unruly. And as I have made it a rule of my life never to keep a disobedient servant, the sooner we part with her, the better. As I never whip my servants, I do not want to depart from my rule in her case. Maggie was true to her womanhood and loyal to her mistress, having more than once communicated to her ears facts and sounds of which reflected no credit in his. For several repulses such as this, it was that she became obnoxious to her master. Cousin Maria, you certainly have forgotten, I'm sure, When last at the North, you promised in presence of the girl that I was to have her, and I'm certain she's expecting it," explained Mrs. Ballard. "This I admit," replied Mrs. Franks. "But you very well know, Cousin Arabella, that that promise was a mere ruse to reconcile an uneasiness which you informed me you discovered in her after overhearing a conversation between her and some free Negroes at Sarasota Springs." "Well, cousin, you can do as you please," concluded Mrs. Ballard. "Colonel, I'm weary of this conversation. When am I to expect?" inquired Mrs. Franks. "It's a settled point, my dear. She must be sold," decisively replied Franks. "Then I must hereafter be disrespected by our own slaves. You know, Colonel, that I gave my word to Henry," as Blake, "her husband, your most worthy servant, that his wife should be here on his return. He had some misgivings that she was to be taken to Cuba before his return, when I assured him that she should be here. How can I bear to meet this poor creature who places every confidence in what we tell him? He'll surely be frantic." "Nonsense, cousin, nonsense," sneered Mrs. Ballard. "Frantic, indeed. Why, you speak of your Negro slaves as if speaking of equals. Make him know that whatever you order, he must contend with. I'll soon settle the matter with him, should he dare show any feelings about it," interposed Frank. "When do you look for him, Maria?" "I'm sure, Colonel, you know more about that matter than I do. Immediately after you left, he took the horses to Baton Rouge, where at the last accounts he was waiting the conclusion of the races." I'm going to stop here. So you see, brothers and sisters, that during our bondage, we were not supposed to feel anything, okay? We were, in fact, legally and culturally considered to not really have feelings like white people had feelings. So, Henry, who is also Blake, his wife is about to be sold while he is away doing duties for his master. Now, once again, brothers and sisters, as I am about to close, I want to again thank you very much for being here. I'm just looking at my comments. Fabulous. Thank you, Cherise. Thank you, Runaway Slave. Julia Wright is here. Listen, Julia's in Paris. I want you all to know that Julia Wright just ain't anybody. She's the daughter of the famous African American writer, Richard Wright. And I'm so glad that she was able to come through. So, good people, I know these books are a bit difficult. I understand. I've been teaching for years. But the only way for you to know your history is to know your history. And the best way to know that history is, of course, through the literature that was written by people who were already there, or scholars like Edward Baptiste, who put together these testimonies of African American people. Now, once again, before I close, I want you to share these episodes with your children, with your family members, with friends, and even people you don't like. Share them anyway. Share them anyway. And always remember this: I love you dearly, and I mean that sincerely. I pray for you every night and every day, and probably throughout the day. I want good things to happen for us, and I want us to raise a generation of very noble, strong, and intellectual people. So, I will see you again this coming Thursday, and I look forward to that immensely. So take good care, folks. And this is Dr. Regina Jennings signing out.